Welcome to Onward. Welcome to this event, Mars versus Venus, Exploring the Political Gender Gap. So we're hosting this event in the wake of a new report on the political gender gap, written by my colleague, Nicholas, and based off polling work that we conducted in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and with the help of JLP polling partners. And with us to discuss the widening gender divide, its causes, and whether we should be at all skeptical of its existence. I don't think my panel are at all skeptical of its existence, by the way. We have John Burn-Murdoch, Chief Data Reporter at the FT. We have Poppy Coburn, Deputy Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. And we have Nicholas Stevenson, author of the aforementioned report, which is catchily titled Ballot of the Sexes. So I'm going to go to each of our panelists for their opening remarks, which is going to be 5 minutes long each. Then I will have a couple of questions for them all. And then we're going to open it out to all of you and get your questions coming in, hoping to have lots of time for Q&A, because I think this is one of those topics where lots of people have views and queries. So do start thinking about your questions. Okay, John, can I please start with you?
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep mine fairly brief. And I should say as well, this is all sort of evidence-based theory, but not by any way conclusive, decisive. There are many theories for what's happening here. TLDR, I think the rapidly changing digital media landscape and splintering of information environments is almost certainly playing a major role here. Several things seem to be happening simultaneously. The first is a rising share of young adults are single, in part because teens are spending more and more time scrolling instead of hanging out. There's really solid data on this, and so you get fewer cross-gender friendships and potential for relationships. This alone explains a significant amount of the polarization we see, because single people are much more polarized than those in relationships. If fewer people were single, the overall gap would be smaller. Why is that? Well, people in relationships are much less likely to consume gender-polarized content, and their partner is a constant check against polarizing ideas. I can vouch for that. Even if they do consume content in echo chambers, they're likely to discuss things like immigration or Gaza with each other. And people in relationships are also simply less likely to spend hours scrolling in their free time. But because of the rise of solo scrolling and highly personalized media diets, a sizable and growing share of young men and women are seeing very different news stories day after day. And I think we really have to start wrestling with this. Imagine if most young men were reading the Telegraph and most young women were reading The Guardian. I think that's basically where algorithms have got us. And again, I'm not talking about everyone, but a sizable minority. Would we be surprised if people cared about different things, prioritized different things, if they were reading different things? I don't think so. And this doesn't even mean we don't even need to rely on the bogeyman of misinformation. It's just different information that different people, different true information that people can be seeing. And finally, it's about how culture war topics in news and politics have now become a key part of entertainment via social media. So everyone essentially has their own cable news channel in their pocket now, and every time they open it, they're getting all the hot culture war topics, and the particular flavour of them presented by their favourite presenters. This gives us what I call the decline of the don't know. So again, a chunk of what we're seeing in polarisation is just that young people used to be way more likely to say don't know. Like, who are you going to vote for? Don't know. Are you left or right? Don't know what that means. That kind of thing. Whereas now, by the age of about 16, everyone's got a sense of who they're with, because they're constantly bombarded with stuff pushing them in one direction or the other. So I think those are some of the key dynamics here. Long-term socioeconomic trends for each gender matter as well. I'm sure we'll get into loads of that. But I think what's going on with digital technologies, information, social media is, I think, arguably the most important thing.
Yeah, so brilliant. Phoebe, you kind of mentioned in your introduction there whether or not we agree that this polarisation is happening. I think we all on the panel definitely do, and I think probably everyone in the audience probably agrees as well. It's very much ambient in the culture. In particular, there's this new kind of media archetype that's sprung up of the idea of the radicalised young man. There's not just that TV show Adolescence, but the idea of like a slightly sinister younger guy with like quite right-wing politics. This is so recognisable in the culture that it's now become a bit of a trope. Something I find personally very interesting, though, is it's not just men who've been moving towards the right, which is something I think has been discussed and looked at, sometimes in a slightly worried way, a slightly moral panic to it. But what's happened to women, and young women in particular? So in the 20th century, it was the case that women were generally on the right, particularly in Britain. So the Tories fought tooth and nail to stop women from getting the vote. And to their surprise, particularly to arch conservatives like Lord Curzon, they were their most loyal voting bloc. They would not have won many of the elections in the latter half of the 20th century had it not have been for women voters. And this is something that's captivated all sorts of different groups into why that was the case. So lots of feminist scholars were very confused as to why women were voting right-wing. Lots of people on the right were very confused as to why women were voting for centre-right parties. So what we've seen, and this has been a relatively recent shift, if you're thinking of it in terms of a century or so, why are women now moving towards the left more so than why men are moving towards the right? You are seeing that right return for men, but it tends to be more extreme for women. I have a few theories for that, and this kind of comes into what you've been talking about, John, about the kind of alternative way that we consume media and information specifically. So you mentioned 2 newspapers. You work for a newspaper, I work for a newspaper. Hopefully no one in the room is going to tell my boss this, but young people don't really consume newspaper content. Or if they do, they consume them on social media, right? They're not actually picking up a newspaper and flicking through the pages. They're often not even reading articles online anymore. The way that most people of my generation consume information is through short-form video content. What's interesting is that the genders have kind of self-segregated online as to where they get their information from. And this was a process that was happening when I was coming of maturity. I remembered that sites like Tumblr were very female-coded, and then sites like Reddit felt quite male-coded. And then that's as other social media sites have come through, like TikTok, Instagram Reels, that's quite female-coded. X, particularly after Elon Musk took it over, quite male-coded. So it's not just that they're consuming different types of information, but they're on entirely different platforms. And that's significant, right? Because then you don't have that buffering effect where you're talking to other people who across the sex divide who might be disagreeing with you. And if you are young and you're not married, you don't live in a house with each other, you're not having those friendly chats around the table, maybe not so friendly chats about politics. You are just talking to people who not only agree with you, but probably look like you as well. In terms of what that means just quickly for political parties moving forward, I don't think it's a coincidence that young men and young women are not just moving left and right, but they're moving to new parties of the left and right. So it's not that young women are really in favour with the Labour Party and young men are really going for the Conservative Party. The opposite is true. Those two parties are completely declined in relevance for people of Gen Z and millennials to a lesser extent. They're going towards new upstart parties like the Greens. They're going to the Reform. You're seeing this across Europe as well. Germany is a really good example. The polarisation between these two, you cannot think of more different political parties within a democracy than Die Linke and the AfD, and they have a massive gender divide between them. So I kind of feel what's been happening with social media is then just playing out on a different scale in the political realm, right? Where people are making a conscious choice that these parties are almost unconsciously appealing to a set of issues that appeal to my sex. And because identity now is very important and really does play a very significant role in voting patterns and party affiliation, it's kind of inevitable that this sort of thing would happen. Now, the implications for that for the political centre are not very good. Maybe if Gen Z, as they get older, they get married, they own a house, well, the trends are saying that they are less likely to do both of those things. So I wouldn't really bet on them moving back towards the political centre. And maybe we'll be able to speak in the audience section about how you actually deal with a more polarised world, because I really don't think it's going away.
Thank you, Poppy. Nicholas.
So, from Seoul to Berlin, men across the Western world are moving to the right, and women are moving to the left. But until now, the kind of commentary out in the UK have asserted that the UK is kind of a rogue outlier and is almost resistant to such trends. It remains left-wing while other countries kind of continue on the gender divide. However, our recent polling paints a very, very different picture, and I thought I'd quickly go over 4 key points from the report to kind of start with. First, there is a stark gender divide in the youngest members of Gen Z when it comes to headline voting intention. While 27% of women 16-23 intend to vote Green, only 25% intend to vote for the Conservatives or Reform. 46% age of the same age group vote for either the Conservatives or Reform if you're a man, and only 14% intend to vote Green. Point number 2, this gender divide extends to the priorities of these voters and what they think are important. Among young men 21 to 25, 41% selected levels of immigration as one of their 3 most important issues. This tied prices, food and energy bills as their top concern. On the other hand, women of the same age, only 23% selected levels of immigration. Meanwhile, 30% selected the conflict in Gaza, which was actually their 3rd top concern. Point number 3, which I think is important to kind of go with, is the polling was conducted from August to September, 26th of August to 8th of September. And this means that it was conducted while the Green leadership election was going on. While the Greens are leading among women 16 to 23, they may actually now be doing better. You've seen a bump post Zach Polanski's election. So they may actually be nearer the kind of 35 to 40% mark among young women if we redid the polling today. This would kind of reach similar levels to Die Link in America, who surged to 37% of the in America, in Germany, yes, who surged to 37% of the vote among women aged 18 to 24. Meanwhile, among men of the same age, AFD led with 25% of the vote, AFD being the far-right party and Die Link being the far left. And my fourth and final point, is that young Gen Z are disillusioned with democracy, dissatisfied with life, and facing falling living standards. And of course, this leads to them increasingly voting for more radical parties. 47% of men aged 16 to 23 and 45% of women 16 to 23 vote for either the Greens or Reform UK. This is compared with just 33% of men and women 24 to 40. Put simply, if Generation Z's voting behaviour does not change as they get older, they represent an existential threat to the mainstream parties who will have to adapt to a more volatile and gender-polarised political environment if they are to survive.
Thank you, Nicholas. So, John, I'd like to start with you, but I think this is also something that Poppy might like to come in on. So, when we're thinking about, and this is something Poppy spoke about, conservatism among women, particularly in the last century, to what extent is that something to do with parenthood? And then more generally, young people are becoming parents later in life. Do we understand, how good is our understanding of how that affects people's politics? And do you think that that strong base of conservatism among women in the last century was to do with motherhood?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
I mean, one thing, weirdly, rather than parenthood, was church. So certainly, if we go back to like early 20th century, women were more likely to be the ones taking the kids to church, being involved with the church community, and church was obviously a conservative, coded lowercase c conservative. So I think that was a significant part of this, while men were more likely to form political beliefs through work, i.e. workers' parties. So I think that was a chunk of it. Poppy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because it reminds me of, I was reading a slightly more like left field interpretation of this question by Louise Perry. And one of the things she mentions as well was church attendance. And she stipulated that perhaps non-organised religiosity might be a quite powerful reason behind women getting behind social causes, whereas men are more still, to this day, interested in issues like the economy, wage growth, the ability to buy a house. This is something that is reflected in social sciences. I'm aware sometimes it seems a bit woo-woo when you're like, women go this way and men go this way, and that's because they have a feminine soul and they have a masculine soul. Like, I don't really buy that. But it is true that women tend to have higher agreeableness. They tend to score higher on traits of being high neuroticism. And that does reflect in political choices and political priorities. So it doesn't really surprise me that the way that women's role has shifted in the last 50 years as they've entered the workplace, as they've moved away from those kind of organised structures, their politics have also shifted. I think that's kind of makes sense.
I've noticed Zach Polanski using the word empathy a lot in his tweets and in his various appearances. When you hear, I mean, for you, is that a feminine coded, possibly like trying to appeal to women's greater? Is that maybe how you see that when you hear him?
I mean, yeah, I do genuinely see it like that. I mean, I hate to say this because this is so like the opposite of the way that I actually think about things. But I recognise that
You're
I'm
very
clearly not
unempathetic.
representative of anyone because I'm a young university-educated woman. I'm on the right, so I am a bit of a freak in that regard. But yeah, I do think. I mean, even in the political priorities level, right? The fact that the conflict in Gaza scores so high. That's not just a case of material self-interest. That's interest in social issues, not just in the UK, but abroad. And that is significant as to why I don't think that's just down to we are all on different social media platforms and we're getting access to different information.
Just on the Gaza thing as well, I think there's a particular bit about children there as well, like the emphasis of what's been happening to kids in Gaza, I think really, again, draws out some emotional responses that might be that bit more likely among young women, but I think the social media does come into this though, and not to contradict anything, but just to add to it. I think it's that initial slight inclination towards or away from a certain type of content in the algorithm era just amplifies it way more. And there was research done in the 2010s which pushed back a bit on the idea of echo chambers, but we're just in a completely different environment now. Like back then it was more about who you followed and the conversations you got into, and you would encounter pushback to things, whereas nowadays there's no conversation, there's no pushback, it's just a stream of content. And so I think those subtle inclinations can become these much bigger divides in terms of what gets pushed to people. So it sort of amplifies small differences.
I really agree with that because I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently who is actually my roommate, and she's voting Green, and we were talking about how the internet is different from 10 years ago to now. And she used the word like it's all slop. You just sit and you kind of passively consume stuff. You would actually have arguments online about politics as a teenager. It was very easy to do so. But you don't really do that on TikTok. Like you do just consume content, and that's why the algorithm thing is so powerful, right? Because it's not a conversation. It's just it's almost like TV, right? You're just sitting there and consuming something.
Yeah, and I think it's weird, but like honest as you're saying it, I'm like I miss the days of arguing with people online. They were so much healthier.
I think I almost kind of disagree slightly with what's been said there about like TikTok social media algorithms. Because I think social media algorithms actually have almost opened up. Because if you think a few years ago, people would read, say, a paper, they'd read like the Daily Mail, they might read a few other things on like BBC, a few other outlets. But nowadays, you will get a kind of, it's almost opened up to a wider web of opinions. And of course, you'll have your echo chambers, but social media algorithms and some of the way they work. So for example, you will see something on TikTok, you can like it, if you like that thing, that opinion might agree with yours, but you may also disagree with an opinion, and if you do that, you're more likely to, say, spend time scrolling the comments, and therefore it will get recommended to you because you're engaging with it more. So actually, the way that social media algorithms can work is that they can actively promote the most kind of counterintuitive views,
like
the most
outrage bait.
the most incendiary views. So in a way, it's almost not that there's a lack of discourse in this way, it's that people are seeing more content that they disagree with and disagree with very, very strongly, which is driving them further apart.
I think the only thing I'd say on that, I think that's a really, really good point, though, is that it's still things that people deeply care about, right? You can care about something in the sense of like thinking this is awful, whether it's Gaza or some like small boats, or for example, but it's still then like living in your head. Even you wouldn't say I like this, but it's the algorithm knows that you are. It gets you going, as it were, and that it then is just more present in your mind as you're thinking about politics and that kind of thing.
Before the event actually got started, Poppy was talking about the different communication styles of different leaders and about the what good communicators people like Farage and Trump are, and how good they are at appealing to what you might describe as a sort of the radicalized right-wing young man. Nicholas, you are a young man. You are on the right. We won't say that you're radicalized, but do you... Are there, both from the perspective of the polling and from having thought about this for some time, and also actually thinking about your friends, and when you look at communicators like, maybe the best political communicators of our age, like Farage and Trump, what is it? Is there a way that are there ways that they're saying things, or is there language that they're using that is appealing to the demographic that you are part of?
So I think one of the main issues with young men is that they've been quite problematized in today's kind of culture and the rhetoric in the media. There's a lot of negative stuff, like when you hear stuff about the manosphere, it's instantly negative, like anything to do with men's spaces online. There's always stuff about Andrew Tate, which Andrew Tate is not actually very popular at all among young men. But I think that Farage and Trump tap into that discontent quite well. It's also one of our questions in the poll was, do you think you're faring better or worse than your parents? And men were much more likely to say that they were faring worse than women, although both said that their parents' generation kind of had it better. And I think that's a real thing. Men will compare themselves to their father, and as women kind of compare themselves to their mother most of the time. You will have that. It's easier to kind of, if you're a woman, essentially say, right, compared to my mother, I'm doing better because things are better for women now. But men have roughly kind of stagnated in comparison, and I think that Farage and Trump tap into that, and it's a real strong indicator for discontent among men.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit? So there's a group that you identify in your analysis of the poll, which I found very interesting, which you call Generation COVID. Are you part of Generation COVID?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Just right at the very end, I'm 23.
And you say that it could just be a function of their being younger, right? Yeah. But you note that this particular group are particularly divergent in views between young men and women. Do you see that as probably a result of more time spent alone scrolling, less time spent socializing because of the pandemic? That sort of splintering that John was talking about becoming worse then?
Yes, and I think we've touched on it quite a bit already. Yes, there are some of these echo chambers which will recommend to an extent content that you kind of agree with, and men and women will inhabit very different online spaces. Again, there was talk about Twitter. We did polling that showed that Twitter is much more kind of male dominated. Then you've got TikTok, which is it's very high among both. 88% of young women 16 to 20 use TikTok regularly. I think it's about 70% of men of the same age. There's still that kind of, TikTok's a more female space. But you will have these very different parallel online spaces where women will engage with something that's very, very female kind of stuff. And then you've got men who will say there's kind of gaming, more stereotypically male stuff, and they won't really interact outside of that. And I think that the pandemic really drew people into those spaces, and that has really driven polarization.
Before we open up to the audience and get their questions in, there's something I wanted to get your views on, John and Poppy, that came out in Nicholas's work. So Nicholas found that when asked about how society treats men and women, women were most likely to agree that society treats women worse, and men were most likely to agree not that society treats men worse, but that it treats them the same. That wasn't surprising to me. Difficult for me to say why exactly. It's surprising. What do you think about that?
It totally doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
But also in a way that you can't easily pin it down to here's something that's actually happened to women recently in the UK in the way that I think you probably can in the US, even though I don't think that's a full explanation. You could say, look, when Roe was overturned, that's why women are so angry and that's why they're moving to the left. There's not really that moment in the UK, and yet the same trend has happened, right? Where women are far more likely to be dissatisfied with their lot in life and to feel that they're actually being actively oppressed by some powerful group at the top. I don't know how much of this is just that that's a thing that people say and talk about a lot. I know that's not a particularly great explanation, but this was just something that I remember being discussed all the time at school. It was very much embedded in. I was young when millennial feminism was big, and that was the message that was kind of coming down. And I don't know if it's just that became a kind of truism, and that's why it was kind of accepted. Because it doesn't reflect in terms of material outcomes. Women are outperforming men, particularly when they are younger, when it comes to stuff like school attainment, universities. So it's not they are objectionably worse off than the generation that came before them. That's just not true.
I think that 100% agree with all that. One thing I've been pondering is whether the young men and women are answering different questions. Mm-hmm. The young men are thinking, how are we doing compared to how we used to be doing? And thinking, well, we're doing worse. And the young women are looking at society today and saying, well, the average woman, again, older, is doing a bit worse. I've certainly had conversations with young women who are like indignant at the idea that, what do you mean women are doing better? And they're like, well, are we talking about better than then or better than men? So I think maybe that's part of it. But I think your point about US narratives and vice versa, I think is super interesting as well. Like now that we all occupy this Anglo internet, or the Australians are always asleep, so it's more like us and the Americans and the Irish. I do think that you get that. I think in reverse, to go on a micro digression, is housing, where the housing situation is way worse in the UK than the US, but American millennials still talk about the situation as if it's that bad. So I think 100% these things sort of bleed across.
Interesting. Could we go to the audience for questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the definition of left and right. So in the old days, it used to be libertarian to socialist, but there's also now attitudes towards immigration and foreign policy, Gaza, and so on and so forth. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about left and right?
Nicholas, how do you think? This is a difficult question. How do you think young men and women are thinking about the left-right divide? Is it meaningful to them? I mean, do they think of it more in terms of like Green Party versus, or your party versus Reform?
Well, I think the left and right divide still very much kind of exists, but I think a kind of more relevant spectrum today, or ideological spectrum, would almost be those who are kind of more establishment and those who are more in favour of radicalism. So you have anti-status quo, pro-status quo. And one of the things that we work with JLP on this poll, and Jim Blagden, and he put in a little grid where it was essentially to that extent you had those who were in favour of, those who were kind of leaning left and in favour of kind of more radical reform of the status quo voted green, while those who leaned right were in favour of kind of radical reform voted reform. But then anybody who was kind of pro-establishment, pro kind of things changing gradually, voted Labour, whether they were left or right. And it's going to be interesting to see where the Conservative Party, and even to an extent the Lib Dems, I think many people see the Lib Dems as like arch kind of status quo. They're just right in the centre. It'll be interesting to see where the Conservative Party kind of goes in terms of that. But it's very interesting, and I think it's almost more relevant today to kind of go with how much, to what extent are you in favour of the status quo, and to what extent do you want reform of it?
Thank you for your question. Could we have some? Yes, you sir at the end.
So, building on Poppy's point about Greens and reform seeming to benefit from this divergence, what do you think this means for coalition building for the different parties in elections? So, how would a cynical politician exploit this? Is the answer for, say, Greens and reform to just double down on it and go like more radical when it comes to the sexes, and then Labour and Tories, like what are they doing? Do they become more radical, or do they try something different? Can you give your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I've also just remembered that I'm supposed to repeat the question into the microphone for the benefit of the live stream. So I'm going to sum up your question, which our panelists have heard in full, as how would a cynical politician exploit the political gender gap to win, or at least to come close to it? John?
So South Korea, this is basically what happened, right? So you had a real leaning into being the young men's party and the disbanding of the Ministry for Gender Equality and that kind of thing. And I think South Korea always gets invoked in these debates, but the South Korean situation is incredibly different. It's so much more polarized. You've got extraordinarily steep gender divides there and extremely steep gender inequality. So I don't actually think there is much to learn from that. I'd almost say that is a lesson of what not to do. I mean, just from a cynical electoral strategy sense, there is not a big enough coalition of either gender that votes based on its gender for that to make sense. So that's one thing I cling to out of hope, actually, is that even though other forces, non-capital P political forces, might be causing this divide to emerge, I don't think we have political systems in the West that are going to exacerbate that.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree with you, John. I also think it's not equal for parties that are going for a male demographic and a female demographic. So we were briefly talking about this before we started the panel. I have like this theory that reflects on like children's books, right? If you're trying to sell a children's book and it's targeted towards a male audience, female children will still read it. But if it's targeted towards female children, male children won't really read it. And I think you could kind of extrapolate that for US politics, right? The Republican Party, despite having like very like machismo aesthetics, I mean, just look at like the White House Twitter account. They're literally posting about Halo at the moment, versus what the Democrat Party is doing, where it's desperately trying to figure out like how to get male voters back on board, but is failing so badly because it's kind of like feminine coded. And it's struggling so badly with its comms that it's just lost that demographic of young men. Whereas like the Republican Party still does pick up like a big chunk of female voters, maybe not like, you know, white college educated young women, but they don't need them to win. So I agree with your point, but I do still think there are probably ways to exploit if you're on the radical right, getting through on the basis of a coalition. I think it's more achievable for a party like Reform than it is for something like Zach Polanski's Greens. I think it's much more difficult for them.
Thank you. More questions, please. Francois.
I have a question about kind of emerging trends. We've been talking a lot, I mean, this may be just a Twitter thing, but the kind of Nick Ferty phenomenon with the kind of generational resentment. Is this something that is escaping the Twitter bubble and that young people care about? Or is this simply kind of an epiphenomenon talked about a few people who will rant about the triple lock and Winter Field Hours?
Interesting. Yes, Poppy.
I think that economic self-interest is not a driver really for radicalism in young people. I kind of wish it was, because I think it would lead to better political outcomes, but I just don't think that's reflected in like what's pushing people.
Why don't you think it
in
is?
a certain direction? I've noted like the Conservative Party, for example, is going really big on the idea that if you sell an idea of prosperity, that will get young voters back on board, because the idea is they want to have a house, they want to get a mortgage, you know, start a family, etc. I'm not really sure that's entirely true and the way to actually win over people. From what I can tell, the reasons people are getting really angry about the country around them are not as simple as, you know, I don't have like a cash-free ISA. So people do recognise that the country is getting worse, but they don't necessarily articulate it in a narrowly economic vision. Like, I'm not really sure they're thinking in terms of, I'm annoyed because my money is going towards pensions. I get most young people, including on the radical right and the radical left, think that pensions are too low, even though you could make an argument to those people that they're not. So I don't think that's going to appeal to people outside of like kind of wonk Twitter spaces. I say that as someone who's kind of in that sphere. No offense meant.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with that there's a habit of sort of resentment mongering against older people, and actually normal young people just don't think that. And we wouldn't actually want them to think that way. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, I think like it's real, but to Poppy's point, it's small. It's basically the sort of centre right. There's probably a few Nicolas Sturtillons in this room. I think it tends to be people who are slightly higher earning as well. It's the sort of I'm doing okay. I'm nominally doing okay, but all my taxes are being taken away to be spent on blah 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 blah. Which in the UK, high earning young people are, you know, there are about 6 of them. So I mean, I think that's maybe one small part of it, but. There was a super interesting study recently, I think, to echo Poppy's point, super interesting study just showing that people just don't find economic issues as attention-catching in the current media environment. So people analysed what literally caused people to change channel when watching cable news in the US, and crime and immigration keeps people glued to the screen. And then as soon as you move to the economy, people literally switch channel. And my sort of theory here is that social media is essentially becoming everyone's personal cable channel. So people absolutely do care about the fact that they don't have as much money as they would like, they can't afford housing and that kind of stuff. But it just doesn't literally capture their attention as much as other issues. So it's a real concern. But in any given survey, the most recent thing that will have popped up will have been something culture-based.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's now it's sort of lower salience in a way. Although I feel like there is definitely some resentment towards older generations. But it's I think an interesting example as well was you mentioned South Korea. Lee Jun-sok, who is the man who did very, very well amongst young men, he won that group despite only getting like 7% of the vote overall. Is that most people talk about the fact that he was strongly kind of almost anti-feminist. He focused on like abolishing the gender ministry. But one of his other policies was to go really quite hard on stuff like pension reform. and some of the kind of economic populism. So, and it was quite popular. It was popular very much among young men, but it was also on top of that kind of cultural push, as I think both of you highlighted.
Something that I know actually we haven't discussed, Nicholas. The other sort of big crisis that one hears discussed in the context of young people, much more than we hear the political gender gap being spoken about, is mental health. Right, like something we've been hearing about for a long, like 5 years, all the time. There's a huge mental health crisis among young people, COVID, etc., but before then as well. To what extent do you think that interacts with any of this? Is there any kind of relationship there? Should we be understanding them as like related phenomena?
I think there's a little bit of this for sure. So this comes back to something Nicholas was saying about the sort of horseshoe politics thing. One of the theories for what's happening there is it's about cognitive rigidity, or like need for closure. So people need things to make sense and be simple and just work. There's a certain thing that you can score on various psychological scales. And for these people, like, two things are true. One, you often get these mental health problems because the world isn't actually like that. So you get anxiety and that kind of thing when things aren't simple and don't always make sense. But also that is often what drives people towards populists of the left and right. It's because people come out and say, don't worry, vote for me and I'll fix everything. So I think there is, like, in that sense, a genuine overlap. And then Poppy's point as well about neuroticism or emotional instability, whether we're talking about the slightly overrepresentation of that among young women, or whether that in general in the population, people who are anxious are more sensitive to threats, whether they react in a more reformy way or a more empathetic Polanski way, they again tend to be overrepresented among people who vote in those ways. So yeah, I think that there's certainly some overlap there.
I think just very, very briefly, there's also a really rich body of literature on this stuff from like a quite like extreme faction of the American right, and they've been looking at this stuff for over 30 years. Like, this was a big discourse in the 1990s amongst kind of like reactionary thought in America around women taking Prozac, and they were like, well, because all women are on Prozac and depressed, that's why they're voting Democrat. So this has been like in the air for a very, very long time.
People sort of say similar things about the pill now.
Yeah, they've been saying it out there for a very, very long time. So that, you know, I recommend if anyone's interested in that stuff, like, do look it up.
I'm not saying that the pill causes left-wing politics, just to be clear.
They've been writing about this stuff for a really long time. So people have been trying to make the connection between mental health and political affiliation. I do agree actually with John's point though. Like, if you are more anxious, you do look for simpler solutions, and obviously these new parties tend to offer that stuff.
Could we have some more yes, this gentleman here.
I was wondering, to what extent is the education system becoming more, I say female coded, I don't actually mean it's advantaging arbitrarily women, but we know that girls are more conscientious, they're better at exams, that was mentioned already. But perhaps men or boys are more risk-taking, and that's something that's not reflected in an education system that's heavily exam focused. I'm wondering if is that a fair analysis, and if so, is that a possible solution to diffusing tension between the genders?
The solution being sort of sack all female teachers or something. Probably not. Sorry if you.
So the question is, for the benefit of those online, the question is, to what extent is the way the education system works perhaps unintentionally driving a gender gap, and can it be used to give us a fix? Oh, can we go to John and then Nicholas, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really interesting. It's hard to disagree with the theory. Like Richard Reeves, who I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, has written a lot about this. And the simple fact that primary, especially primary, but also secondary education is now there are far more female teachers than male teachers. That's all true. But I think the evidence for this causing the stuff we're talking about here, I think, is more mixed. Certainly, the subject matter that is taught feels quite independent of who's teaching it. Boys are still picking certain subjects. Girls are still more likely to pick other subjects, regardless of who the teacher is. And again, I know part of the argument is that the actual curriculum has been sort of feminized as well, which again there's varying evidence for. The main issue I have with this one is just the timeline. Like, that has been an incredibly gradual process over decades and decades and decades, whereas generally what we're talking about here is a shift over the last 10 to 15 years. So again, I think it's really interesting, and maybe there's something there, but I don't know if it can be easily, I don't know if it easily explains the more short-term shift we're talking about here.
Oh, yeah. So, I think we do need more kind of male teachers, particularly in primary. There's so few of them that there really aren't that very many kind of male role models apart from at home for many.
Why don't men want to become teachers?
I think there's still that kind of stigma that it's it's kind of female role, and there's always this kind of thing in men that, you know, if you become a primary school teacher, you know, it's really kind of frowned upon. It's viewed as a bit weird, and I think we really do need to we need to fully kind of tackle that. But on the men and women on the curriculum, it has got because I've read something somewhere that the reforms recently done by the recently, a few years by the Conservatives, where it became more exam-based, actually did work to kind of boys' benefits. Women did better on kind of coursework. Teachers kind of graded them better. And I think I also read somewhere that during COVID, there was a bigger gap in some of the subjects as well, where women got higher kind of grades on the teacher test grades than men did. There was a kind of widening there. And that, again, kind of links to it was basically 100% coursework. So I think, there's been some progress there, but obviously women still have better kind of educational outcomes.
Thank you, Nicholas. Question from this gentleman at the back.
So I think it's Eric Kaufman has been doing a lot of work on the impact of mobile phones on education. And it seems to me that the gender moving away from each other and being in a relationship and the doom scrolling and everything is beginning in school. And he and others are coming up with some, not just removing mobile phones from schools altogether, but actually, you know, only brick phones for children under 16 and then heavy restrictions 16. So it seems to me that there's a major contributing factor. I don't think it's the cause, because I think, as everyone's been saying, it's kind of accentuating what was already there. But it seems to me that the outcomes of doing the kind of proposals that Eric and others are suggesting not only would ameliorate some of what we've been talking about tonight, but actually improves educational performance more generally, lower levels of anxiety, more relating, more traditional friendships, more socializing outdoors. So I just wonder if the panel could comment on that.
Thank you very much for your question. So the question is about essentially can reducing children's access to mobile phones in schools help us with this problem? So I think it is actually, we're probably now ready to start talking about fixes. So if I can ask you that question, please, Poppy, and then actually I'd like, after that, just prepare you, John, I'd like to go to you and get you to talk a little bit more about relationships and the mutual intelligibility that we were discussing before the event.
I generally think it's just a good idea not to give children smartphones. Although I'm not someone who thinks that, I'm not like frightened of the internet. I'm not frightened of social media because I grew up on it and I think it was great. I would not want to return to a time when there's like 3 TV channels and you're just sat there like passively having information chucked at you. I think the internet's a great thing. I think social media is a great thing. No, of course. But one of the things that's interesting here about so there's no gatekeepers anymore, right? This is one of the reasons why politics has become more extreme. It's not just the way that you consume media, but it's also you have access to things that like you just didn't have access to before. When you were like reading through a traditional newspaper, when what the editor said was going to go in the paper and that was it. You were getting like one person's opinion. Now you have access to all other streams of information. Now, do I think that's a great idea when you're 14 years old? No, I just think it's too emotionally taxing. You know, my mum actually works in pastoral care in a secondary school, and it does mess those kids up like in a massive way. It causes like bullying issues that you couldn't believe on. But in terms of like putting the genie back in the bottle more permanently, because you can't keep people offline forever, I don't think you can do that. I think you're going to have to learn to adapt to a more polarised environment. I don't think it has to be the end of the world. You know, maybe there is work to be done to better regulate these algorithms, but you're not going to get people to go back to the community centre. You're probably not going to get them to go back to the pub. This is just a change in the way that people are communicating. And there are political parties that are responding to this and adapting to this. These are the new populist parties that we're seeing coming through. So I almost worry that, you know, we're going to end up like King Canute, like saying stop to the tide. This is a technological change. In the same way that people spoke about television, people were spending less time in their community, getting less engaged with mass politics. That was all true. And yet we adapted to it, it became normal to us. I think this is just the latest version of that happening. So the way that we make that happen without democracy falling apart, I don't know. But you're not going to undo this, I think.
Oh, welcome to comment on that, John, before you move on to the relationships point.
I mean, I really just like the clarity of what you're saying there, because I do think it's true that there's such huge structural forces that the idea that we can just flick a switch, as you say, just doesn't really hold water. Like, I was thinking about this today. It's essentially what's the health version of that has been obesity, and miraculously Ozempic has come along. So Ozempic for politics or for society, I think is almost what we need. But just to go back to your question, I think I think the importance of relationships and socializing and stuff is just massive in this. And I'm really interested to see with the phone bans in schools. I'm almost more interested in the social impacts than the educational ones, because it's true that educational performance has dipped in some places, but I think there are so many second order effects from looking at your phone instead of hanging out with people. Like, fun and life and so much happens from hanging out with other people. And that's really markedly dropped off a cliff over the last 10, 15 years. So I think anything that changes that would be massively beneficial. I guess one of my hopes is that it almost becomes low class to be on TikTok all the time. And when I wrote that in a column for the FT, I was told that's low class was a harsh way of putting it. I was like, but it is what I mean. I think if we get to a point where being the kid who's always scrolling on your phone gets you frankly picked on, that would be good for society. Bad for that kid. But genuinely, I think policy it will be, if we think that this is what's happening, the displacement of in-person interactions with time spent on phones, I think a cultural sort of stigmatization thing might work more quickly, even if there would be all sorts of like downsides to it, than anything coming from either government or the tech companies.
Thank you, John. Can we get... Yes.
Thank you. Just on the solutions point, I appreciate a lot of the discussion has been about the cultural divide aspect, but on the potential economic driver. I was wondering if there's any evidence that a lack of lack of a view of personal economic strength is an issue here, in the sense that particularly perhaps younger men who are from more working class backgrounds or low socioeconomic backgrounds have for a long time found faith in parties like the Democrats in the US or Labour, and now they feel as though those parties have nothing to say to them anymore. And sort of constantly, and this is an exaggeration, but they're constantly being told they're sort of privileged, but they're struggling to get on the housing level, or struggling to even get by day to day. But the potential solution is to actually focus back more on class divisions and economic factors as a solution to the cultural divide.
So the question is it the case that for men who are lower down the socioeconomic scale, the economic security is a big factor in terms of the political gender gap? Can I go to Poppy and then to Nicholas on that?
Yeah. So income obviously does play a role, but something I find really interesting about how we define what we would maybe actually bring in, like the idea of the low class, the class differential, which is more of an identity thing than a clear economic thing, is whether or not you've been university educated or in the US college educated. Because I think we all know that the graduate benefit is now pretty small. The money that you would be making from having got an undergraduate degree doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be out earning people that didn't get one. And yet the political divide between those two groups of people is so incredibly vast. And it actually tells you more about someone than I think their sex and their race, which is quite remarkable, right? You can actually see this in the report. I found it quite surprising that there were so many women white women who were actually voting for reform. It wasn't the number one, but it was quite high up. And I would love to see more of a breakdown about whether or not it's university educated and how that has an impact on things. Because in the US, it does have a massive impact. If you're white, but you're university or college educated even, you are far more likely to support the Democrats than you do if you're white and you're non-college educated. It's such a massive parameter. And yet, you're not going to have a different economic outcome because of that. And I wonder how much of it actually comes down to identity and how you're constructing your identity of yourself, rather than I am wealthier and so I kind of support the Democrats because it's gauche to support like the Republicans under Donald Trump.
Thank you, Poppy. Nicholas.
I always wonder to what extent the kind of graduate university gap is kind of really adjacent to the class gap, because obviously you've got more working class children kind of go into vocational things. They don't go to university. And with worsening graduate outcomes, the worst kind of people doing who are going into kind of universities and get the worst outcomes are still people who are going there and are kind of a lower class background. So I think there's quite a lot of overlap actually between the two, and I think it also comes back to that kind of how much are you in favour of kind of reforming the status quo, how much are you in favour of kind of gradual reform or kind of the status quo in general. And you see that kind of with Reform and the Greens, they're doing kind of better amongst those non-university educated, but also those with kind of lower socio-economic background. And Labour and the Conservatives are really struggling to appeal to, and the Lib Dems as well, really struggling to appeal to those groups. And Labour, of course, being the party that traditionally appealed to the working class. It's a real loss for them and a real turnaround. That, I mean, we were looking at some of the micro data into it, and like of the really very highest earners, Labour's vote share was huge. Like they are the party of the very wealthy, and it's a real kind of turnaround from what their kind of traditional purpose was.
Thank you, Nicholas. Can we have some more questions, please? This gentleman here.
I've heard quite a lot this evening about like the various causes of the phones, technology, one of the biggest things, also like education, and the fact that like people aren't living with each other and not talking across the gender divide. What about the effects? I think that like we talked a little bit about the fact that young men and women aren't being in a relationship, and that's causing their politics to be different. I've personally observed like the opposite causal relationship, where like we get men and like young men and women who like either they break up because they're arguing about Trump, or they're not getting together because he's saying something that she just finds like completely like incomprehensible as an argument to her. And I think that it's reverberating not just like in these people's personal relationships, but also like other stuff as well, where like in universities, for example, you get like certain courses where there is a gender imbalance, certain views become like completely normalized and others just like don't feature whatsoever.
So the question is, how is the political gender gap actually changing the lives of these young people, changing like their environments in university? John and then Poppy?
Yeah, I think it's circular on your point about what causes what, right? So I think you'd have to say, presumably, if this starts in people's early teens when they've got their phones, then it's probably starting a little bit from what the phones are doing then. But then, yeah, absolutely. While it might prevent someone from being in a relationship, it can also break up relationships. That can have downstream effects. Like the impacts on birth rates, I think, are not zero. They're not huge. Like, and it's these days, every conversation we've got to mention birth rates at some point. But again, Korea is the extreme case, but this will, of course, impact that as well, which has economic, social, all sorts of consequences. I think your point about the role it can play in other domains like university courses or perhaps workplaces is really interesting. Like the more we end up with self-segregation in other domains of life, the more that's going to lead to some weird outcomes. And then my most sort of doomy view on this is, if you look throughout history, generally when you have a lot of young men with no connection to the rest of society, bad things happen. You could argue that like burning down asylum hotels, that kind of thing is again, you need a reservoir of bored young men, bored like disconnected young men for that as well. So again, it's not a simple one-to-one relationship, but I do think, yeah, there could be much bigger socio-political consequences down the line from this than just who votes for who.
Yeah. I had a conversation with someone who's like in his 40s, and he was talking about dating for Gen Z, and he was like, "Oh, I feel like I got the last chopper out of Saigon. Like, it really sucks for you guys, doesn't it?" I think that is kind of true, right? I hate the word woke. I think it's really cringe and annoying, but it is a good shorthand for describing when the personal became political, and like it really did impact I think how people were forming relationships, not just romantic relationships, but platonic relationships as well. It is entirely true that it is really, really hard for people that hold certain political views to be open with those political views, and then that acts as like a hardening mechanism for them. I think it comes more from young women than from young men. Like, I think young women are way more hostile because they can kind of afford to be more cheesy, because the way we now meet people is done online, and it's much easier to kind of just like swipe on someone on the basis of a few characteristics. I think that probably does actually have like a big impact on how people then relate to people across the sexes. Again, we're not South Korea. Like, we haven't got to the level where we actually really actively hate the other sex on the basis of not being able to form relationships, and our fertility is like 0.6 or something. But I do think that's a driving force, and I think it's something you definitely see for younger people who don't have the normal outlets. It is just true. You're in these like self-electing gender bubbles. And if you like don't go outside as much as you did before, because that's just not the way you socialise, I don't really see the way you rectify that.
You were sorry, just 1 second, Nick. You were talking about Canute attempting to and failing to hold back the wave. So John has just painted, at least gestured to quite a very negative outcome of like young men who have like no obligations or like interest in society, like forming together in like groups or something. I mean, is there you sound fairly not necessarily blasé, but as you say, like, there have been major changes before, like the effect of TV on society. We've adapted. We moved. It's fine. We function well. Are you very worried about the political gender gap? Do you look at it and you just think, oh, we can evolve around this? There are ways to soften this. What is it that you think is the most likely outcome here?
I think it's significant. I don't think it's world-ending. I think it's consensus killing, but I think the consensus was already kind of dying off anyway. Right. Again, as I said at the beginning of my opening remarks, when we say left and right, that doesn't mean Conservative Party, Labour Party. People are just moving towards more political extremes, partly because there is a broader sense that the middle isn't really delivering for people. Again, it's not just a social media thing. It's more broadly, it's not just young people. That's a sense that loads of people across the spectrum have, male, female, young or old. So am I concerned? I think it's going to be a problem. Then you have a hyperpolarized society and you can't deliver. The problems come when you do get those parties that have garnered votes on the basis of we're going to fix things, who then can't fix things. Where do we go from there? In terms of the male-female divide stuff, I don't really know how you easily rectify that. You can't force people to stay in the same spaces. I think you can try and enforce some kind of code of conduct in the public sphere. And again, I don't think we're at a South Korea level where we need to be really, really worried about this stuff. But I don't know, as a policymaker, how you even address this. Genuinely, what would you do? Anyone in Parliament can tell you it's difficult enough to change the things that are actually within your wheelhouse to change, let alone change the relationship between the sexes on a global scale. It's just not really possible for you to do.
Nicholas, can I give you the last word and ask you to, quite briefly say what you think is the realistic outcome of the direction that we're going, and if you had to pitch a fix, you may not have one, that's fine. If you had to pitch a fix to our leaders and to policymakers, what would it be?
Well, I think briefly, just to touch on the relationships point, it's amazing how even in people who are currently in relationships, the amount of political tension that exists. I know so many people that just do not talk about politics with their partner. That they're in a very happy relationship, but they do not talk about it at all, and it's such a source of tension when it comes up, because young men and young women just have polar views, or even these people in a relationship, and you wonder whether that's going to work out long term. But it has. These people are in fairly year-long relationships, and I think so. The question was, it's the kind of realistic outcome.
Yes.
Yes. So I think it is the case that this gender gap is a kind of global trend. You see it in all these countries like South Korea, America, Germany, Spain. It looks like it is here to stay. One of the potential fixes that I think I kind of talk about in the paper is that you see millennials and those who are kind of doing better in life, kind of getting on the housing ladder, starting a family, are more likely to vote for Labour, Conservative, these kind of less radical parties. So one kind of potential thing could be if these parties can deliver, if Labour can deliver, they can deliver for young people with prosperity, then that will essentially kind of narrow the issue. You see no actual kind of noticeable gender divide among those who are married. So that's one potential fix. But looking at the current situation and what's going on in general, it doesn't look like there's many kind of easy solutions. All of these problems, housing and related, just aren't quite getting solved.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. I'm very grateful to you and to John and to Poppy. And we're all